Today I'd like to do a video that focuses on urban shelter gear for your bug out bag, maybe even your get home bags, from a design strategy and a list of tenets standpoint. So we're all familiar with the big three of prepping being food, water, and shelter. Well, shelter is probably your most important one to do initially in an emergency situation. You could survive 3 days without water, 3 weeks without food, but if you don't have proper shelter, you're not going to be able to really gather those supplies. So you want to make sure you have a good shelter in place. That's even reinforced with a lot of survival-based documentaries and TV shows, even shows like Naked and Afraid. They're not going initially looking for water, they're building their shelter right away, so then they can do those other things. And it's also a very important topic to discuss regarding your bug out bag, because it's probably going to take up the most amount of real estate in your bug out bag. Sleeping bags are large, tents are large, sleeping pads are large, things like that. So it takes up a lot of space, might even cost a lot of money and take up a fair amount of weight. And so when you're talking about weight, you want to think of it in pounds instead of ounces for things like your bug out bag, and you could really shift one way or another based off of which item you choose for that shelter item. So the purpose of your shelter is to protect you from the elements. So we're talking about things like temperature. You don't want to get too cold at night. We're also talking about things like general weather, like rain, also with snow and sun as well. You don't want to be beaten down by the sun over time, so you might want to have some shade. And then lastly, it also protects you from things like insects, critters, anything that can really crawl on you at night. You don't want to be infested with bugs, mosquitoes, things like that. And so shelter protects you from all of those. So when I think of shelter, I think shelter consists of three things: what you sleep under, what you sleep in, and what you sleep on. So this is all the things that make up my shelter module for my bug out bag. So when we're talking about things that you sleep under, that's something like a tent, a tarp. You can even probably go with a hammock, especially if it has a roof on it. When you're talking about things that you sleep in, we're referring to things like a sleeping bag, maybe a bivvy, a blanket. And then what you're sleeping on, that's going to be like a sleeping pad, maybe even a pillow, a ground tarp, even a piece of cardboard could be used for shelter in an urban environment. When you're talking about shelter, there's vast differences between having shelter in a rural environment compared to an urban environment. In a rural environment, there's going to be a lot more trees, for example, in which you could then use something like a hammock. You're also going to have more of a soft ground, so there's going to be more dirt then that you could keep in mind. And then also there's going to be a lot more insects in a rural environment that you have to be concerned about. In an urban environment, there's going to be a lot more man-made structures, things that you could leverage, and a lot more concrete. So that concrete could be on a wall, it could be an overpass, and also on the ground. So your ground is going to be a lot different in an urban environment than it is in a rural one. Whatever you decide to use for your shelter module of your bug out bag, I think it needs to be a family decision. So if you're a lone wolf, for example, I would just do whatever works best for you individually. So that might be something a lot more small, like a hammock or even a bivvy tent, small, lightweight, and just something that you're just going to be using. But if your bug out party is going to be your family, for example, I have a family of 4, I have to keep that in mind, and you want to keep in mind, keep up morale in an emergency situation. For example, Miss Urban Prepper really does not like bugs and does not like the idea of using something like a tarp, which is what I used in my previous bug out bag. Even though it's a really nice tarp, she does not like bugs, doesn't want to get bit up by mosquitoes, and she also she wants to be located on the ground. So the idea of using a hammock, for example, even if it was a large hammock, she would like to have some kind of overhead where you could prepare things. You're not hanging off the ground. And so that's something that I have to keep in mind when building my shelter module. So you'll see that in the following video. So basically I'm going to have a bug net, and it can't be a hammock. Another thing that you're going to want to think about is your appearance. Do you want to go for high visibility, or do you want to go for more of the stealth route and think about things like camouflage? I think that's going to be a personal preference depending on what kind of emergencies you're preparing for. But in my personal preference, I would probably prefer for going more on the stealth route. I have other methods for signaling that I include in my communications compartment, ways of making myself more visible in an emergency situation. So I prefer to blend in and be hidden with regard to the shelter module for my bug out bag. That way, for example, I'm not going to just get a bright orange tent and I'm going to be locked into a high visibility shelter module. Instead, I probably want to go with something a little bit more discreet, and I could add that high visibility later if need be. So I have a few personal tenets in my personal shelter module that you'll see in the following video. The first tenet that I have is it has to be fairly long. I'm pretty tall. I'm around 6'4", 6'5", depending on what time of the day I wake up. That's around 1.9 meters. And so I need to have my shelter be something that's at least 90 inches or 2.3 meters. The second tenet that I have is I have to be able to store the entire family and gear in there. I don't want to have just us in a shelter and the gear stored somewhere else. I just would rather have that be close by. So it has to fit the family as well as things like backpacks. And then lastly, it needs to be fairly small and lightweight, but high quality due to my bug out bag size. As the male in the family, you end up being the family Sherpa and just carrying everything. So, but I still want to keep in mind that I need it to be small and lightweight, so my bug out bag isn't too heavy as a whole. So since my shelter module is focused for more of an urban environment, I think this is a good opportunity to learn things from the homeless that are in an urban environment, especially in your region. For example, I live in the Seattle area that you see in the background here. So from what I see from a lot of the homeless that live in my area, they're really leveraging these man-made structures. As you know, in Seattle, it rains a lot. So you'll see the homeless really leverage things like overpasses, buildings, indents into buildings. There's a lot of things that they could use for their shelter, in addition to what they also carry in a backpack, maybe even things like a shopping cart. And so we really want to leverage things from the homeless, but I just want to keep in mind that out of the scope of this particular video are going to be things like where to set up your urban camp. I think that should be a dedicated video. And then also the topic of makeshift urban shelters, things like a hovel and things like that. I think that requires a little bit more research on my part and should probably be dedicated to its own separate video. So that's going to be out of the scope of this particular video, but those are definitely things to think about as well. Let's first go over the topic of what you're going to sleep under. So again, in an urban environment, there's urban specific shelters that you could leverage, things like buildings, overpasses, doorways, walls, and you want to leverage those things with your bug out shelter module. And so I have a rankings of man-made shelter additions that you could use with your shelter module. So the first thing, the number one ranking I have is just a general structure, whether that be a building, something that's structurally safe that you could go in, might even have a door to it. Then you don't really need to worry about setting up a tent or anything like that. That's what I'd be looking for first. And you might already have something pre-planned ahead of time at your bug out location. The rank number two is I have just a overhead cover, so things like an overpass. They're not really going to go anywhere unless there's like an earthquake or anything like that, and you could really block a lot of rain. The third ranking that I have is things like a wall, like maybe a building indent, things that you could use to shield from wind and also use to set up your fire that's nearby a wall. That's something that's very common in a rural environment that you would do with wood then. In an urban environment, there's a lot of concrete walls, brick walls, things like that. And then the fourth ranking is just general open space, whether that be in a park or in just maybe a concrete area similar to this, or we have open space but maybe not anything over you or to the sides of you. So that's the ranking that I have for the man-made shelter additions. So again, I listed a few of my personal tenets regarding my height and things that I'm looking for my bug out bag. Since I am going with more of a family bug out approach, my wife also has certain tenets. Again, she wants to have insect netting. She wants to be on the ground, which I also think is good for kids too. You don't want to have kid prepper worrying about mosquitoes and things like that. So keep up the family morale. With tents, there's a couple different choices that you could go with. If you want to go with the tent approach versus the tarp approach, I'm going to have to go with more of a tent approach due to things like the bug shielding. But with a tent, you're going to have to think about things versus a freestanding tent versus a non-freestanding tent. Freestanding, basically you pick it up and move it if need be. Non-freestanding is something that would probably leverage things like trekking poles and things like that. I'm going to include a link in the description box below for some expert advice on the pros and cons of freestanding versus non-freestanding tents, and also cover things like double wall versus single wall. That's going to be covered in the link by Appalachian Trail, so make sure you check that out. So one of the first options that you could think of for what you're going to be sleeping under is a tent. So in general, a tent, some of the pros that you're going to have with it, you're going to probably have a little bit more comfort as far as space goes. Also the durability of it, how it handles wind. Bug protection is a big one with the tent. Especially if you have one that's lower with more of a rain flap or anything like that, you're going to have a good warmth with it versus being in a tarp where maybe you don't have as much warmth or winds coming through there. And I think just overall you might have a better morale in it because it's more of a home type structure. And with regard to cons of going with a tent, you're thinking about things like storage size. Tents are fairly large, even if you go with the ultralight approach. The weight of it is also going to be something that you're going to have to consider. Tents are oftentimes 5 pounds, and that's a lot of weight when you're thinking of a bug out bag that you might want to keep between 30 and 35 pounds. And then you're talking about things like cost. The latter you go, even the more expensive it's going to get, and just tents in general are usually pricey. Another option that you can think about for what you're going to be sleeping under is a tarp. And that's what I was using in my previous version of my bug out bag. It was a nice ultralight tarp, and I thought it provided me with a lot of flexibility, although Mr. Prepper didn't like the idea that bugs could get in. So some of the pros with the tarp are things like size. You could really store a tarp in a very small amount of space in your bug out bag. The weight of it's going to be extremely lightweight. The cost is usually a lot more affordable than going with a tent. And then there's a lot of adaptability that you can do with the tarp. You could set it up again with one of those kind of makeshift shelters. Maybe just create an overhead for you. Also set it up in some kind of A-frame type scenario. A lot of flexibility with having a tarp. Some of the cons are things like warmth. You might have a channel of wind coming in through that tarp. You're going to have to worry about things like bugs, insects, crawly things, rats in an urban environment. And then also with the tarp, you're heavily reliant on the ground stakes. And when you're looking at places like this where there's a lot of concrete, you can't really stick your ground stakes in there. You might have to have more of like a concrete nail gun or something like that. So that's something you have to consider with a con for a tarp. Another option that you could use for what you're going to be sleeping under is using a hammock, and that's very popular, especially for more of the lone wolf type emergency kits. With the hammocks, some of the pros are they're very small in size, so you could easily fit that in your bug out bag without taking that much real estate. The weight of it's going to be good. The cost of it under $100 usually for a high quality hammock. And then also gets you off the ground, away from things like the bugs and critters and things that are going to be on the ground. Some of the cons for a hammock are going to be setup locations. In an urban environment, again, you usually want to have trees for a hammock, so you're going to have to find a place that you could attach that. In an urban environment, it's probably going to be a little bit more difficult than a rural. So setup locations, also the internal dimensions, fitting a family of 4 in a hammock might be a little tough. And then if you don't have a cover, things like rain is something you're going to have to worry about. And that covers the hammock for what you sleep under. Again, in an urban environment, probably one of the best approaches for shelter is to go with a makeshift shelter. That's what you see a lot of the homeless people do, where they're just blending in with their environment. But again, that's going to be out of the scope of this video. So I'm just going to be covering dedicated Bob gear only. But if you're interested, make sure you Google something like a homeless hovel, for example. There's a lot of dedicated videos for that. I might actually include some of the supplies for that in Miss Urban Prepper's bug out bag kit versus my own. So I think they should complement each other, but I definitely think it's a good topic to research. It's just not going to be covered in depth in this particular video. So as far as learning from the homeless with regard to shelter for what you're sleeping under, what I see a lot in the region that I'm at in Seattle is that the homeless are leveraging oftentimes a freestanding tent, and then they're using plus a man-made overhead. So almost every time I'm on the freeway, I see an overpass, and I'll see multiple tents set up underneath there. So they're leveraging that huge overpass for protecting for the initial things like rain and weather, and then they have their own private little shelter in a module that they carry with them, usually in the form of a freestanding tent. So that's at least when we're talking about what to research for my particular environment, from the homeless, from the urban homeless, I'm seeing them using a freestanding tent with a man-made overhead. Now let's talk about what you sleep in. So when I think of what you sleep in, I'm talking about things like a sleeping bag, a bivvy, even a blanket. So this is a topic that's always been on my mind, even dating back to 2011. I had a video called How to Store Your Bob Sleeping Bag, because I was always concerned about losing the loft or the integrity of your sleeping bag, but having it compressed over, we're talking years, 5 years. It's just not good for a sleeping bag. So it's always been a topic of a concern with me. So when we're talking about a sleeping bag, some of the pros that you're going to have with it is just a general warmth of it, with weight of it. Everyone that's climbing at Mount Everest, they're having a sleeping bag. They're not using a bivvy or a blanket or anything like that. So warmth and the overall weight of it is it's very nice for what you're getting for your warmth. Some of the cons then are going to be your size of it. It's going to take up a lot of real estate. How you're going to be storing it. Usually you want to have your sleeping bag folded out and not just compressed over time. Also, the price of it is going to be pretty expensive. Sleeping bags can be several $100s for a good one. And then the last con that I have is just being concerned with the wetness of it. So if it gets wet, a lot of the times it's going to be not good for retaining any kind of warmth. And so that's what I have listed for the pros and cons of a sleeping bag. Probably my personal favorite for what you're sleeping in is a military grade wool blanket. Those things are just awesome. You can get them, I go over to military surplus stores to pick mine up, and I can get them for a very reasonable price. And it's a wool blanket is usually our go-to item of warmth when we're out camping and things like that. We always have wool blankets with us, just because I think they work the best in my opinion. But so the pros for a wool blanket are your warmth. It keeps you extremely warm, especially if you put it over your sleeping bag. Storage for it, you could store that thing rolled up for years, and you're not going to really lose the integrity of that blanket. Next, the price of it, especially if you go with a used military one, you could get them for 10 to 20 bucks is what I found. You can get them brand new, the Italian made ones for $60, $70. Next, it handles wetness extremely well. You're not losing as much warmth even if it's soaking wet. And then the durability of it is just fantastic. But then we get to the cons of it. The number one con is that it's very large. It's going to take up a lot of real estate in your bug out bag. And next, it's heavy. It takes up a lot of weight in your bug out bag as well. So my little pro tip for that is to try to find a way of leveraging a wool blanket with your kits, but maybe storing it elsewhere. So maybe having it in a vehicle or in certain caches or other locations, but it could be leveraged with your bug out bag. But that's everything covered regarding a military grade wool blanket. The next thing to talk about regarding what you're sleeping in is something like a bivvy. So bivvies are very small. That's a good pro regarding them. You could easily fit them in a bug out bag. The weight is extremely lightweight. We're talking less than a pound for them. Storage, they could be compressed for a long period of time. And then the price, you can get a bivvy anywhere from $10 up to $70. Still a lot more affordable than a high quality sleeping bag, for example. When we're talking about some of the cons for using a bivvy, just the overall warmth of it, you're going to be a lot more warmer in a sleeping bag or in a wool blanket than you will in a bivvy bag. Next for the cons, just the general durability of them. We're constantly rolling them up. I'd be worried about tearing them in an emergency situation. And so that's the pros and cons that I have listed for a bivvy. Again, out of the scope of this particular video is things like makeshift blankets, maybe newspaper, cardboard, things that you might see the homeless in your region use. But from what I see from my urban environment with the homeless is that they're using a combination of a sleeping bag plus a blanket. And that's what I'm seeing often, that they're in a sleeping bag and then they're covered themselves up even more with a blanket. The next category to talk about is what you're going to be sleeping on, so things like a sleeping pad. So there's a few different options that you could go with. Let's start off with the first one being an inflatable mattress. I recently got to go visit a local business, Cascade Designs. They're the parent company of Thermarest, Platypus, MSR, and I got to see how they made all of their mattresses, whether that be inflatable or foam ones. It was very interesting. It was an awesome experience. But some of the pros for using an inflatable mattress, number one is going to be the storage size. They're so small nowadays. You can get them for anywhere from around football size to even smaller sometimes. So the storage size of them, the weight of them is going to be extremely, they don't weigh that much. And then also the comfort level, if you get the right high quality one, you're going to be a little bit more comfortable, I think, just having more space off of the ground from what you're sleeping on. With regard to cons, I would say the cons for an inflatable mattress would be things like durability, worrying about puncture. If you're on concrete like this that's covered in glass and rocks, that'd be something I'd be very concerned about in an emergency environment. The robustness of it, you're basically going to be able to sleep on it. That's it. You can't use it for a stretcher or even a seat or anything like that. It's a little more difficult. It's meant to be used as a sleeping pad. Next, the price of it often tends to get very expensive. Something like the Neo Air All Seasons is $180, for example. And then I think the speed of assembly in general is lengthy. So you're going to have to be blowing these things up, even if you're using a pump. It's not a quick, set up an inflatable mattress. It does take some time to set up, and maybe you don't have time in an emergency environment. Another option for what you could sleep on is something like a foam mattress, a foam cell mattress. So the pros of those, the robustness of it, a lot of different options that you could do with the foam mattress. Yes, you could sleep on it. For the ones that fold up on each other, you could use that even as a makeshift seat, something you could sit on. Also, you can even make it with a back pad and a seat, just the way that they kind of fold up. They're going to be a lot more rugged. You don't have to worry about things like punctures and things like that. So durability of a foam mattress is going to be good. The weight of them is very impressive. The weight that you could get on those, again, less than a pound. The price, you could get a foam mattress anywhere from $20, $30 around that price range. And then the speed of assembly is very easy, just to unroll that thing, or however if it's stacked up on each other, or if it's just a roll, it's just real quick to set up, so you don't have to be worried about blowing up a mattress or anything like that. For some of the cons on a foam cell mattress, we're talking about things like storage size. These things, you can't really condense them down, so they're going to be large. They're going to take up a large amount of real estate on your bug out bag, so most likely you're going to have to attach it externally on your bob. So either on the base or the bottom portion of your bob, or even on the sides of it. So storage size for the foam mattress is definitely a con. On version 2.0 of my Urban Bug Out Bag, I used a lightweight cot, and it was made by Luxury Light. It was a very nice cot. Some of the pros of it is that the robustness of it, yes, you could sleep on it, but you could also use it as an emergency stretcher, for example, which I thought was a really good option for it. The durability of it, you could set this thing on concrete in a puddle with shards of glass and nails and tacks, and it wouldn't affect you at all. You're raised off the ground, and it would not affect the cot. I thought that was awesome for it. Also, just the general comfort, I found it was most comfortable for me. But as far as the cons go, which is why I'm going to be replacing it in version 3.0 of my bob, is things like the size. It's taken up a lot of size, and then the weight, more importantly, it was generally heavy. Even with the ultralight versions, we're talking less than 3 pounds. So there was just a little bit too much of weight that I wanted to allocate to what I'm going to be sleeping on. And then lastly, the speed of assembly. It takes a little bit of time to set this thing up, put all the poles together, and get it so it's set up completely. You're going to be spending 5 minutes doing it at least. And it's definitely not as quick as just unrolling a foam pad. And those are what I have listed for the pros and cons of using a cot for your shelter module. Another thing to think about is more of an accessory is having a pillow with you, which is very common for backpacking, hiking, maybe not as much for an emergency kit, although it's definitely something to think about. So I would say it's not needed, but it's definitely nice to have. You want to consider the storage size of them and then the durability of them. Oftentimes they're going to be inflatable ones, and so you're going to also have to think about things like puncture on it. But definitely think about having a pillow. I think that'd be good for morale, but you definitely have to weigh the pros and cons with having a pillow. Moving back to what we're learning from the homeless, from what I've seen in an urban environment with the homeless, they're oftentimes using a rolled foam mattress pad, something that they're rolling out, and then they're using man-made disposables, things like a cardboard, for example. So again, using a foam pad and then stacking cardboard on top of it. Let's talk about some of my personal shelter module goals. So the things that you're going to be seeing in the following video, I want to make sure that my shelter module, number one, is family friendly. I can fit the whole family in it. I'm going to be the primary shelter person in our bug out party. Number two of my personal shelter module goals is just the efficient backpack and storage size weight. So I don't want it to be too heavy. I don't want it to be too small either. I want it to be just the right size for storing in my bug out bag. Number three is the speed of setup. I don't want it to take too long to set up my shelter module. I want to be able to set it up in 5 minutes or less. And then number four, I want to go with more of a gray man approach. And when I talk about that, not necessarily talking about like a urban homeless hovel, but I don't want it to be bright in visibility. I don't want it to be bright yellow, bright orange. I want it to be more blend in, where if I need to, I could tuck it away somewhere, even if it's in a park in the bushes somewhere, and it's not going to really stick out. And if I need to, I have other methods for becoming visible. But I'm going to definitely go with the gray man approach for my shelter module. That's going to do it for this video. I hope that you guys enjoyed watching it. Again, we dive deep into the whole aspect of urban shelter modules for something like your bug out bag. But I'm curious, I've talked about some of the things that I'm interested in. I'm curious on your thoughts. Again, for me, shelter means things that you're sleeping under, things you're sleeping in, and what you're sleeping on. And I tried to dive into all the different options for that. And so in the following video, this video series, I'm going to be talking about what's included in my shelter module for my urban bug out bag version 3.0. But I'm really curious on what your guys' shelter tenets are. So what your kind of philosophies and beliefs are on what your shelter should be in an emergency kit, especially if it's for an urban environment. So in the comment section below, leave your comments regarding your thoughts on shelter tenets. Again, I hope you guys enjoyed watching this video featuring your shelter design strategy, and stay tuned for more videos featuring my updated urban bug out bag version 3.0. See you guys.